It is therefore not at all surprising that this god entered into certain affiliations with Demeter, the earth goddess of Eleusis, the Thracian origin of Eumolpos, the founder, according to legend, of the Eleusinian priesthood, adding plausibility to the union, while Iacchos, whose name is etymologically akin to Bakchos, one of the divine personages of the mysteries, was a form of Dionysos. That feature of the rites in which Persephone, Demeter's daughter, was redeemed from Hades as the personal representative of the initiates was such as to attract Dionysos in his capacity as releaser from Hades, a function which he derived perhaps from the power of wine to release the mind from care and worry. And myth records that he liberated both Ariadne and Semele from the eternal bondage of the underworld. Although the fountain nymphs are often said in legend to be his ministrants, this is not to be taken to imply that he was a water god. If the easiest interpretation is to be followed, it means rather that the Greeks regarded the watercourses as aiding him in the production of an abundant growth. To count the god of fertility as the deity of wealth is an easy transit for the imaginative mind, and a late and uncanonical myth, as we may term it, depicts him in this guise. After Midas, the Mygdonian king, had been given the ears of an ass for having preferred the music of Marsyas to that of Apollo, Dionysus chanced to pass through the kingdom on his way to India. Entertaining him liberally, Midas gave him a guide for his journey, and in gratitude, Dionysus bestowed upon the king the power of turning to gold whatever he touched. This boon, however, proved to be only a bane, for even the food which Midas would convey to his lips became gold, so that he was in a fair way to starve to death. At last he begged to be delivered from his ruthless gift, wherefore Dionysus bade him wash himself in the river Pactolos, whose waters took on the tinge of gold as soon as his body touched the stream. The relation between Dionysus and the Muses goes back to the Thracian period of his worship. From the earliest times in Hellas, his special rituals consisted of songs and dances designed magically to stimulate the growth of useful plant life and to avert such influences as threatened it. At first, these performances were merely crude, spontaneous outbursts of religious emotion, but in time the orderly mind and the creative fancy of the Greek molded them, as it were, out of the dust of the earth into those sublime figures of literary and musical art, the dithyramb, or independent choral song, tragedy and comedy. The divine mission of Dionysius to mingle the music of the flute and to bring Circes to care is transparent through the text of any of the works of the great dramatists. Space allows us to draw attention only to the more important festivals of Dionysus. In Sicyon, Corinth, and Attic, these were made special occasions for musical performances, but only in the last of these three places did they attain to monumental distinction. Here they were 4 in number, beginning, if we follow the order of our months, in January with the Lanaya, the feast of wild women, the Anthesteria, combining ceremonies attendant on the opening of the new wine with the primitive All Souls festival, came next in February. And in connection with this, there took place a symbolic marriage of the wife of King Archon to Dionysus. In March followed the greater, or city, Dionysia, at the beginning of which the introduction of Dionysus into Attic by way of Eleutherae was processionally represented. And finally, in December, the people of the country district celebrated locally the uncouth and unrestrained rural Dionysia. The connections established between Dionysus and professional actors and musicians in the organized festivals led to his adoption as the patron deity of the brotherhoods or the guilds of these performers, societies which continued to thrive until a late date. Sufficient remark has already been made on the general significance of the Dionysiac rituals, but it remains to speak of the ecstasy of the votaries. This was not induced wholly by the use of wine, as is almost universally supposed, for it arose in the first place through the potent suggestiveness of the mere idea that it was possible for the individual mortal, by the observance of certain forms, to become spiritually one with the immortal God, the potency of the concept being immeasurably increased when it possessed a company of people of like mind, even though they remained static. With the aid of dancing, music, drinking, shouting, and participation in the raw flesh and blood of victims in which the god was thought to dwell, the idea threw the votaries into an uncontrollable frenzy, akin to madness in its external demonstration. Whence the madness of the daughters of Proitos and Minyas, and of Dionysos himself. To the field of morals, Dionysos made no new contributions, nor, contrary to the common belief, with all the seeming license of his rites, did he add to general immortality. His gift was mainly religious, although it had a salutary social reaction. To countless thousands, whose individualities had been submerged in the primacy of state interests, he brought a stimulating hope and a buoyant faith in the possibility of attaining to an immortal existence, as free from worldly care as was the divine ecstasy of his ritual. Dionysos in art. After Dionysos came to be represented in fully iconic form, two distinct types were developed. In the first, seen on Attic vases of the 6th century, he is generally shown as a bearded man becomingly clothed, and to distinguish him from a similar type of Hermes, a branch of vine or of ivy is put into his hand. In the second aspect, doubtless given vogue through Pheidias, he appears as a youthful god of inspiration. The cantharos, a kind of drinking vessel, the thyrsos, a ceremonial wand, and a fawn skin are his most common emblems. He is sometimes surrounded by maenads, and his whole bearing is one of ecstasy, so that occasionally he is even shown as intoxicated. It is not, however, until after the 4th century BC that excessive sensuality and effeminacy were attributed to him so frequently as to be regarded as essential features. Myths of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was variously said to have been a direct descendant of Dionysos, a reincarnation of Heracles, and a son of Ammon. After his victorious march to the Orient, the story of the wanderings of Dionysos acquired many new features and a new meaning, although the best-known myths of Alexander relate him to Ammon. It is said that the last of the native kings of Egypt, Nectanebos, fled in disguise from Egypt to Pella, and there became an astrologer in the court of Philip. As it happened, Olympias, the queen, came to him for a reading of her future, and he told her that by the god Ammon she would conceive a son who would rule the world and avenge her on the king for his cruelty. Just as he said, the god approached her in the form of a serpent, and in due time she became the mother of a son whose birth was accompanied by earthquake, lightning, and thunder, signs which proved him to be divine. Moreover, his very appearance and manner marked him as one not of the common order of kings, for his right eye was as black as night, and his left was as blue as the heavens, while his hair and teeth, and likewise his spirit, resembled those of a lion. Although he bore no resemblance to Philip, yet the latter accepted him as his son, and was pleased to account for his divinity by tracing his own descent back to Okeanos and Thetis, and that of Olympias to Cronos and Poseidon. On the death of Philip, Alexander marshalled a great army, and at its head marched through many lands. Through Thrace he went, through Italy and Sicily, Carthage and Libya, until he came to the shrine of the great Ammon, where he offered due homage and left a votive inscription bearing the words, Alexander to his father, the god Ammon. Thence he passed on through Egypt, Syria, Persia, and the lands about the Euxine, and at last reached Greece. At the shrine of Delphi he demanded an oracle concerning his destiny, but the priestess refused him, whereupon, burning with anger, like Heracles before him, Alexander seized the sacred tripod and threatened to carry it away. The priestess then made haste to speak, calling him Heracles Alexander, and prophesying that he would be greater than all mortals. Emboldened by these words, Alexander marched to the conquest of the Golden East, where, one after another, the great kings and kingdoms fell before him: Persia, Media, Bactria, India, until there were no more lands to conquer. On his homeward march he fell ill and died, and took his rightful place in heaven among the gods. The Greater Gods. Poseidon and Amphitrite. Poseidon. The origin and the name of Poseidon. If we consult only the geographical register of the distribution of Poseidon's cult, we shall incline to classify him as a god of northern origin, introduced into Hellas by immigrating Greeks. If, on the contrary, we have regard principally for his chief cult centers, such as Corinth and Boeotia, and accept a recent demonstration that his inseparable emblem, the trident, was in origin the lightning bolt of a Mesopotamian divinity, we cannot well help believing that he too came from the east, in which event his cult would first have reached Crete and thence have been spread by sailors to Hellenic ports on the Aegean and Mediterranean. Whatever his initial functions may have been, he became among the Greeks the supreme master of the sea. And to explain his name as connected with Lord, a name of Crete, makes the suggestion as to his eastern origin very plausible. Poseidon in Homer. Homer knows Poseidon as the son of Cronos and Rhea. When the new kingdom was divided, the dominion of the sea was put into his hands, while earth and Olympus were set aside as common territory for all the gods. His home is understood to be in the sea somewhere near Aigai. In the war at Ilion, he displays no great partisanship, although his sympathies incline toward the cause of the Greeks. Yet he saves Aeneas from Achilles because the hour of the former's doom had not yet struck. He was the father of Polyphemus, for whose death he viciously harassed Odysseus by raising storm winds and billows in his ship's path. And because the lesser Aias boasted of his power to escape the perils of the sea, he brought him to a watery grave. He is the ancestor of Alcinous, king of the Phaeacians, and turns one of his ships to stone in mid-sea. He is the mighty supporter of the earth, which he causes to quake by rocking the waters which bear it up. And the trident, apparently by this time conceived as a fish spear, is uniformly the emblem of his power. In appearance he is grim, and his head is covered with heavy locks of sea-green hair. In disposition he is moody and imperious, and resents those commands of his elder brother, Zeus, which seem to encroach on his sphere of authority. The horse and horsemanship come under his special patronage. The family relationships of Poseidon. Poseidon is everywhere accorded the honor of being the son of Cronos, and he fought with Zeus against his kinsfolk, the Titans, wielding the trident which the Cyclopes had forged for him. His wedded wife was Amphitrite, but he had scant regard for the moral obligations of marriage, for his intrigues with women both divine and mortal almost define counting, among them being those with Tyro, Amymone, Chion, and Libye. His offspring were still more numerous, and practically all of them were in some way associated with the sea: Aiolos, Nereus, Peleus, Glaucus of Pontai, Sinis, Bosiris, Antaios, Boiotos, Polyphemus, and, if we may credit one account, Theseus, all being his sons by many mothers. Not a few of his offspring were of a monstrous nature. For instance, the terrible creatures which he raised up from the sea to harass Ethiopia and Troy, the dragon of Thebes, the ram of the golden fleece, the bull of Marathon, and the bull which maddened the horses of Hippolytus. The functions of Poseidon. In myth and cult alike, Poseidon was preeminently the god of the sea, though all significant bodies of fresh water also came under his sway. The greater number of his epithets record his sundry relations with the sea and with things pertaining to the sea. Nor indeed can it be doubted that whenever he was invoked in worship by the average Greek, his association with the sea was present before the mind, no matter how many other aspects he bore. Inland lakes or springs of brackish water were held to be of his creating. For instance, the so-called sea on the Acropolis of Athens, and he was the chief deity of seafaring communities like Iolcos, Troezen, and Corinth. While he gave no specific encouragement to the building of ships and to the technicalities of navigation, he was looked up to as the most reliable protector of ships and sailors amid the perils of voyage. No wonder that his shrines were very frequently located in harbours. He could calm or trouble the sea as he would. A certain myth represents the award of the Isthmus of Corinth to Poseidon by Briareus as the source of his patronage of that region, and it was here that Iason so suitably dedicated to Poseidon the ship of ships, the Argo. Finally, the doubles of Poseidon reflect his marine character. Aegeus, Theseus, Peleus, and Achilles all stand in some distinctive relation to the sea. Inasmuch as the sea appeared to hold up the land, it was natural to attribute the otherwise inexplicable phenomena emanating from the depths of the earth to the activities of the powerful god of the ocean. It was he who caused the great upheaval which in some remote geological age drained the plains of Thessaly through the vale of Tempe and left the face of nature scarred and wrinkled. And some of the Greeks even went so far as to say that the shocks of earthquakes were due to Demeter's resistance to the embraces of Poseidon, just as a turbulent sea was attributed to a similar brawl between Thetis and Peleus, a duplicate of Poseidon. The roaring and rumblings of earthquake and billow were explained as proceeding from prodigious raging bulls or horses living in the deep hollows of earth and sea, these creatures being understood now as animate emblems of Poseidon, now as identical with the god himself. By striking his trident on the Thessalian rock, Poseidon is said to have produced the first horse, and he it was who gave to Pelops the chariot that could fly over land and sea, drawn by the immortal horses Belios and Xanthos. Moreover, he himself drove swiftly over the waves in his own chariot, nor do we need to be reminded that he was the father of the winged Pegasus and of Arion, the horse of Adrastos. The sacrifice of a horse in connection with his cult distinguished his ritual from that of the other divinities, and at Corinth he even went by the title Hippios, or equestrian. That the horse god should become the deity of horse racing, and finally of the breeding and breaking of horses, involves a very easy process of thought. The god who operated in the unseen depths of the earth was very naturally held to be the giver of springs and spring-fed streams and lakes, the famous fount of Hippocrene being created with a stroke of the hoof of Poseidon's Pegasus. The springs of Lerne were revealed by Poseidon to Amymone, and prior to the arrival of the family of Danaus in Argolis, he had withheld water from the fountains and rivers, so that the land had become parched and barren. So far, then, as water from these sources promotes the growth of plant life, Poseidon is rightly to be designated a god of fertility. Poseidon uniformly appears in myth as a god of little intellectual and still less ethical character. Poseidon in art. Art received its model of Poseidon from Homer. From the best period onward, he appears as a well-matured man, not unlike the type of Zeus, but distinguishable from it by his heavier musculature and his less lordly manner. Ordinarily, he is nude or lightly clad, either standing on a dolphin or a rock, or in the act of taking a step forward, and his frame stoops slightly, as if peering into the distance. He is shown bearded, and with the hair of the head variously long or short, and very often dishevelled. He generally holds a trident in his hand, but if this and the dolphin are absent, identification is often difficult. Amphitrite. Amphitrite does not strictly belong to the circle of the great gods, but owing to her formal association with Poseidon, she may not improperly be brought to our attention here. As the wife of Poseidon, she received many of the honours accorded as a matter of course to the superior divinities. In myth, she was the queen of the sea, and in reality, she seems to have been the sea itself in its aspect as the vast flood of waters which envelopes the earth. As to the meaning of her name, we can merely divine, rather than prove, that it refers to this feature of her nature. In the Iliad, she is scarcely more than an allegorical figure, while in the Odyssey, she has become invested with at least the pattern of a personality, being here regarded as the divine being who sends the monsters of the sea and drives waves against the rocks. Amphitrite was either one of the many daughters of Okeanos or the daughter of Nereus and Doris. Poseidon first saw her, runs the myth, in the company of a sister nymphs in Naxos. Of all those fair ones, she was the fairest, and powerless to resist her charms, he seized her and bore her away to be his wife. In the sea she sat upon a throne at Poseidon's side, and with Thetis led the chorus of sea nymphs in their dances. In art she is depicted as a nereid of queenly mien with moist, flowing hair bound in a net. Chapter 10. The Greater Gods. Demeter, Kore, Hades. Demeter and Kore, or Persephone. The origin and the name of Demeter. The goddess Demeter, the daughter of Rhea and Cronos, is an exceedingly important figure in the history of religions on account of the numerous phases of her character in cult and myth, and also because of the powerful influence which she exerted on the whole Greek world after a certain period. It is impossible to say more in reference to her origin than that, when we go back as far as we can, she still seems to be a Hellenic divinity. Parallels to her cult found among barbarians remain parallels and nothing more, and the fact that she was acknowledged as the chief divinity of the northern Amphictyony is proof positive of a very ancient establishment as a goddess common to many Hellenic tribes. While she is obviously a form of Gaia, she was in function the soil goddess rather than the broadly generalized earth goddess. In the light of her character, it is very attractive to interpret her name as a dialectic variant, but the suggestion will not stand etymologically. A more novel way, and one which conforms to known caprices of folk speech, is to explain the name as an old alliterative form, invented half deliberately, half unconsciously, to correspond to the anti-ethical, thus giving the cooperating divine pair, Mother Earth and Father Sky. And still another interpretation, which is worth considering, makes the name signify barley mother, a meaning quite consonant with the scope of her operations. Demeter in Homer. Demeter is more of a symbol in Homer than a personality. She is the divinity of the corn, and Thessalian Pyrrhasos is known as a sacred field, owing no doubt to its productivity. She has no place as yet in the group of the Olympians, nor has she any part to play in the action of either Iliad or Odyssey. Homer is not acquainted with her as the mother of Persephone, and the story of Amor with Iasion, as related in the epic, will be referred to under the next heading. Demeter as the goddess of the soil. The nature of Demeter is brought out by an admittedly ancient myth found both in Homer and in Hesiod, the latter's account being richer in details. Demeter, divine one of goddesses, mingling in love with the hero Iasion in a thrice-ploughed fallow field in the fat land of Crete, bore Plautos, a goodly son who goeth everywhere upon earth and upon the broad ridges of the sea. Whatsoever man he meeteth, and into whose hands he cometh, doth he make rich, and to him doth he vouchsafe abundant happiness. Homer adds that when Zeus learned of the deed of Iasion, he smote him dead with a thunderbolt. This myth, although not cast in the form of an explanation, seems to be in reality an attempt to solve the origin of, and to supply a divine sanction for, the performance of rites involving the actual or symbolic cohabitation of a man and a woman in a field about to be sown. These ceremonies fertilizing the earth so that she would bring forth her increase and confer wealth and happiness upon mankind. Though the bounty of Demeter comprehended every product of the soil which was of use to men, the cereal fruits came to be regarded as the special objects of her care. All operations on the farm, all parts of the farm, such as barn and field and so forth, which had to do with the cultivation of the grain, the crops in all stages of their growth, the cut grain in the sheaf and on the threshing floor, all these things too came under her surveillance. The first loaf of the newly harvested crop was dedicated to her, and all of her festivals, no matter at what time of the year they occurred, were cereal celebrations suitable for the reason. It has been very happily suggested that from Demeter's role as producer of wealth was directly evolved her peculiar character as the maintainer of political and social stability. If this be so, Demeter is here simply the personified recognition of the fact, so strongly emphasized by modern economists, that the real prosperity of a country varies directly with its agriculture conditions. If Demeter was propitious, social relations were not disturbed, but if unpropitious, the altered ability to sell, purchase, or barter effected a general upheaval. Under the same appellative, Demeter had also an intimate relation to the institution of marriage, and thereby to the family, this being a consequence of the natural evolution of the central idea contained in the field rites. Children were therefore just as much her gifts as were the fruits of agriculture, and on the assurance of a steady birth rate depended proportionately the continuity of the social order. Demeter and Kore, or Persephone. It will be easier to understand the mystic meaning of the bond between Demeter and Persephone when we have reviewed in its entirety the legend which constitutes the theme of the so-called Homeric hymn to Demeter. This Eleusinian story, doubtless through its superior artistic presentation, ultimately overshadowed every other local tradition of the two divinities and came to be the canonical version for all the Greeks. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter by Zeus, was playing in the meadows of Mysia with nymphs of the sea and plucking the wild flowers of the springtime, roses, crocuses, irises, violets, and hyacinths, when she spied an especially beautiful and fragrant stalk of narcissus and hastened to pick it. Alas! This was a snare devised by Zeus and Earth to entrap her, for just as her fingers closed on the stem, the ground opened beneath her, and Hades, leaping forth in his golden chariot, seized her and bore her swiftly away. Only the sun and Hecate, the moon goddess, saw her capture, but her mother heard her cries and instantly rushed forth to seek her. Going about the earth for 9 days and 9 nights, without tasting food or drink, and bearing in her hands blazing torches to light up the darkest recesses. During this time, neither the gods who had been witness of Persephone's seizure nor any omen came to the mother's aid with a word of information. But on the 10th day, Hecate led her to the sun, who told her where the maiden was. Again the distracted mother betook herself to wandering, and having passed unrecognized through many lands in the guise of an old woman, she came at last to Eleusis in a teak, where she sat down by the public well, known as the Fountain of Maidenhood. Hither came the 4 daughters of Celeus, the king of the country, to draw water. Won by their gracious willingness to listen to her, Demeter told them a fictitious tale of her escape from pirates who had enslaved her, and then asked them to obtain for her a place as nurse in some family. Whereupon they took her to their own home, putting their infant brother Demophon in her care. By day Demeter anointed the child with ambrosia, and by night bathed him in fire, as Thetis did with Achilles, and he was like to become immortal when his mother Metaneira discovered the performance of the magic rites and snatched him away. Instantly the goddess threw aside her disguise and, revealing herself in all her divine freshness and beauty, she announced her name and bade the people of Eleusis build her a temple in which she would teach them the ceremonial of her worship. Celeus did as she had commanded, and in the temple she took up her abode. But so great was her grief for her daughter that she withheld her blessings from the soil, so that men began to die for need of food, and the altars of the god lacked sacrifices. At length Zeus sent Iris and the other gods one after another to plead with her to relent, but she would not hear of it until her daughter should be given back to her. Wherefore Zeus dispatched Hermes to the underworld to bid Hades release Persephone. Unable to resist the command of his elder brother, Hades yielded, but before letting Persephone go shrewdly gave her a pomegranate seed to eat, and by tasting of it she magically bound herself to return to Hades after a time spent above. In the golden chariot she was conveyed to Eleusis, where her mother welcomed with an outburst of joy, and when a message from Zeus came to Demeter, announcing that Persephone could thenceforth remain with her during 2 parts of the year, spending only the 3rd part below, she forgot her sorrow and consented to rejoin the gods on Olympus. Moreover, summoning the rulers of the land, Tryptomelos, Eumolpus, Diocles, and Celeus, she made them the ministers of her worship and revealed to them the manner of performing her secret holy rites, rites which would confer upon initiates a peculiar blessedness in the afterlife beneath the earth. Demeter and Tryptomelos. The story explaining the significance of Demeter in agriculture pursuits may be reconstructed by combining several sources. Tryptomelos was the son, according to the variant versions, now of Okeanos and Gaia, now of Eleusis, and now of Celeus, ranking, as son of this last named, either as the oldest or as the youngest whom Demeter nursed on her coming to Eleusis. In her affection for him she taught him to yoke oxen and to till the soil, and gave him the first corn to sow. In the rich plains about Eleusis he reaped the first harvest of grain ever grown, and there too he built the earliest threshing floor. In a car given him by Demeter, and drawn by winged dragons, he flew from land to land, scattering seed for the use of men, and for this Celeus ordered his death. But Demeter, hearing of the intention, removed the king and gave the throne to Tryptolemus. It is said that when he found that a pig had rooted up his first sowing, he took the animal to the altar of his benefactress, and, placing grains of corn on its head, slew it as an offering, whence, ever afterward, the pig was sacrificed in the same manner in the worship of Demeter. The nature of Persephone. Persephone, who was generally known in the cult as Kore, or daughter, was obviously an offshoot of Gaia, the earth goddess, and therefore a duplicate of Demeter. The mother and daughter represented two phases of the vegetative power of the soil, the first standing for the entire power, latent or active, at all seasons of the year, and the second typifying rather the potency in its exuberant youthful aspect, manifested chiefly in the renewed growth of spring. As may readily be gathered, the seizure of Persephone as it occurred in the myth, and her subsequent espousal to Hades for 4 months of each year, are but graphic representations of the annually recurring period during which vegetation practically ceases. Our knowledge of the meaning of the name Persephone is incomplete. The second part is certainly related to the base of the verb to show, but of the first we are entirely ignorant. The mysteries of Eleusis. Like the nature cult of Dionysius, that of Demeter developed in the consciousness of the worshipper along two different lines. Working along the one, it aimed to supply physical needs, and along the other, spiritual wants, the first touching society in the mass, while the second affected the individual. It is with the latter influence that we are most concerned, although in reality the two lines were but one. The difference was a matter of interpretation. The Eleusinia, or Mysteries of Eleusis, took place just prior to the autumn sowing. They began on the 15th day of the month Boedromenian, roughly September, and lasted for 10 days, or a few more according to the historical period, the entire festival being divided into 4 distinct ceremonial acts. The first, which covered 4 or 5 days, consisted in the assembling of the properly qualified mystai, that is, candidates for initiation, in impressing upon them the duties of silence, secrecy, and purity, and finally, in giving them a ritual purification. In the second, the mystai, departing from Athens at daybreak and usually reaching Eleusis late at night, advanced in procession, dancing, singing hymns, sacrificing at the shrines by the wayside, swinging torches, and bearing the image of the infant Iacchos, or Dionysius. The next act involved concerted efforts of the mystai to awaken in themselves the emotions that stirred the heart of Demeter in her search for her daughter. At night, with torches in their hands, they would roam about the seashore, as she had done, haunting those places which tradition still associated with her. As each candidate beheld his neighbor doing the same thing as himself, and presumably through the same motives, the meaning of the ceremony was driven deeply into his soul, giving a 1,000-fold intensification to his belief in the reality of Demeter's power, drawn from her own sorrow, to sympathize with the heartbreak of mortals. When the mystai had all become one with the god, and therefore with one another, they appropriately partook of food and drink in common, and together handled certain sacred objects. Concerning the last act we are told only the barest outline, so sacredly did the initiates keep their vows of secrecy. Substantially, all we know is that the votaries gathered together in the great hall of initiation, and there witnessed certain performances, probably of a dramatic character, and based on the experiences of the Divine Mother and Daughter. They listened, too, to weird sounds produced by the Hierophant and his associates, and into both sight and sound the spectators, with their fancy quickened by long and intense contemplation of holy things, read meanings which were not at all warranted in fact. When the sacred rites were over, the festival terminated with public games. There can be no doubt that the mysteries of Eleusis effected much good in Greece. While the bare substance of their teaching was practically the same as that of the cult of Dionysius, they were much superior as a spiritual tonic, so to speak, in that they strengthened the finer feelings and relied less upon wanton extravagance of action. and many a despondent man became filled with a saving hope at the thought that he too could know the immortal joy of Demeter. Demeter and Kore in art. Prior to the 4th century, art had not devised two distinct types for the mother and the daughter, and in many cases, inscriptions are necessary to identify them severally. Both goddesses were shown with that serious air, which, reflecting a past sorrow, has become a part of their character. In the later art, Demeter appeared as a matron, seated or standing, her head crowned with the lofty polos or covered with the folds of her robe, her emblems being the torch, scepter, bowl, and sheaf. In function, she was now the bestower of grain, and now the grief-worn mother. Persephone became distinctively maidenly in form, face, and dress. As a chthonic divinity, she held a torch, and as a queen, a scepter. Hades. When the kingdom of the universe wrested from Kronos was divided, the dominion of the invisible realm beneath the earth was given to his son Hades. He was therefore not a place, after our modern way of thinking, but a person, and his name, which to the Greek signified the unseen, betrayed at once his dwelling place and his general functions. These simple statements of myth seem to disclose at a single glance the complete story of Hades from the very inception of his career as a divinity. But in reality, as we shall see later on, they are deceptive, for the manner and stages of his growth are by no means certain. While Homer generally speaks of this nether god as Hades, in one passage he knows him as Zeus of the underworld. Yet, although suggestions of royal power accompany mentions of him, real kingly attributes are lacking. His chief function is to put into effect the curses uttered by men against their fellows, and the practice, which continued to a late day, of invoking his name in oaths was a recognition of his power to discharge this duty. For, when one bound himself to destruction at the hands of Hades in event of failure to keep a solemn pledge, he was giving utterance to a conditional curse. From this most unlikely source, the god derived what little moral significance he had, although at the best it was of a negative character. His relation to the principle and to the enforcement of retribution is seen in a rather moralizing genealogy, which makes him the father of the Erinyes. The various appellations and titles of Hades throw light upon his nature. And, indeed, the commonest form of his name, which we have just used, had much to do in shaping his character. Through its obvious reference to the unseen abode of the dead and because of its formal association with curses, which are nothing else than injury by magic, the word became so foreboding of ill that men could not take it easily upon their lips. It was very natural to deny to such a name the beneficent power that gave increase to the crops and herds, so that, as a consequence, the worship of Hades dwindled away and the enlargement of his personality was arrested. Only in Elis did he have a temple and a cult under his name, although as the earth god Trophonios he dispensed oracles in his cave at Lebedia in Boeotia, while his title, Zeus Euboilos, with its evident sedition of the wisdom of his counsel, is a distinct echo of his oracular functions. As Plauton or Pluto or Ploteus, he is the divinity who enriches men with the abundance of the field and the fecundity of the flocks, whence Plautos, the son of Demeter and Iasion, is apparently none other than a double of Hades. With the data available, it is impossible, as has already been hinted, to state in just what form Hades first emerged. It may be that it was in the aspect in which he was known to Homer, as the lord of the departed, but if so, he could scarcely have been a product of the worship of ancestors, for nowhere do we find any Greek stock tracing its descent back to him. A much more probable theory is that Hades was given a being in the mind of the Greek worshipper in answer to the demand that, for the sake of absolute uniformity in the divine government of the universe, the lower world, like the upper, should have its own separate ruler. Hence Hades was a nether Zeus, and exercised over the assembled souls a dominion akin to that of his greater brother over the hosts of the living, both human and divine. Hades in art. One need not go far to find a reason for the fact that Hades was comparatively neglected by the artists. Except in Etruscan paintings, he is generally shown in his beneficent aspects, the cornucopia placed in his hands stamping him as the bestower of abundance, the eagle sometimes perched on his sceptre or on his cap, marking him as the Zeus of his own special realm. His nether functions are suggested by a dense mass of hair, which generally falls forebodingly over his forehead. Chapter 11. The Lesser Gods. Of the circle of Zeus, of light, and of heat. Of the circle of Zeus. Uranum. We have already met with Uranum, the beautiful daughter of Okeanos, as one of the wives of Zeus, and there is a story concerning her to the effect that, long before her marriage, she and the Titan Ophion together ruled the universe from the summit of Olympus, but were at length forced to give place to Cronos and Rhea. If she was actually, as is reasonably to be suspected from her parentage, a personification of the wide ruling element of moisture, this legend may record a very old belief that in the beginning the earth was entirely covered with water, and afterward emerged from it by degrees. Uranum holds an inconspicuous place in myth, and remains little more than a symbol of the far-reaching dominion of a husband. Charities, or Graces. Uranum is best known through the Charities, the lovely daughters who blessed her marriage with Zeus, and who were at first conceived as gracious divinities that caused the soil to bring forth flowers and fruit for the use of man, although they were not yet endowed with the joyful spirits and unaffected charms which have made them a favorite study of poet and artist. A brief legend testifies to the somber character of their worship in the island of Paros. Minos was offering sacrifices to them here when word came to him that his son Androgeus had been killed, whereupon, distraught with sorrow, he commanded the flute players to cease their music and tore the garlands from his head. From that day, the legend explains, flutes and garlands were no longer used in the worship of the Charities, this suggesting that their rites took place during that gloomy season of the year when vegetation had disappeared. In contrast to their worship was the gladdening bounty of springtime, this irresistible infection touching their personalities, and in time transforming them from elemental into spiritual forces. Thenceforth they were divorced from natural objects as such, and stood for those subtle qualities in persons and in things pertaining to the social life of man, which beget the purest joy and happiness. They were associated, for instance, with tasteful dress, with the various forms of art, and with personal and household ornaments, and this connection throws light on their relations to Aphrodite and to the craftsman god in the well-known spring song of Horace. Now Cytherea leads the dance, the bright moon overhead, the Graces and the nymphs together knit, with rhythmic feet the meadow beat, while Vulcan, fiery red, heats the Cyclopean forge in Athena's pit. The Charities are generally held to be three in number, Hesiod giving their names as Aglaia, or splendor, Thaleia, or luxuriant beauty, and Euphrosyne, or good cheer. Themis. The second wife of Zeus, according to the account in the Theogony of Hesiod, was Themis, or justice, and, as we have pointed out elsewhere, She is a form of the great earth goddess. Her primary role apparently was that of controlling the cycle of the seasons, and so regularly did she bring about the periods of productiveness that men came to look upon her as a power to whom they could appeal for the elucidation of matters in which human arbiters failed. In brief, she became an oracular goddess, and the righteousness of her deliverances established her as the personification of justice and equity. Horai, or hours. The Horai, who, according to Hesiod, were eunomia, order, dike, law, and eirene, or peace, inherited in name the social traits of their mother Themis, but, in respect to their origin, her terrestrial characteristics. They seem at the outset to have had to do with the seasonal stimulation of plant life. It was they who adorned the newly created Pandora with garlands of vernal blossoms, and every spring and autumn they were honored at Athens with a procession and were given offerings of the fruits of the earth. We are told that here these divinities were called Thallo, or bloom, Auxo, or growth, and Carpo, or fruitage. But we cannot be sure that these are the official names. In late times, the Horai were often regarded as the hours of the day. Mnemosyne, the Muses. By her union with Zeus, Mnemosyne, or memory, did more than serve as a living reminder of his power. She brought him the 9 comely daughters, the Muses, who, by their many and varied gifts, have done much to give charm to the life of mankind. It has been suggested that they sprang from the same stratum of elemental powers as the Graces and the Hours, and it certainly appeals to one's poetic sense to find personified in them the musical voices of the rivulet and of the foliage of the forest, although we are probably much nearer to real fact if we assign to them the psychic origin which is claimed for their mother. One modern writer advances the very acceptable explanation that they were the mental tension that relieves itself in prophecy and song, the stress to which Tennyson alludes when he says that, "For the unquiet heart and brain, a use in measured language lies." As men became more and more conscious of the state of mind, they tended to dissociate it from themselves and to attribute an independent existence to it. How it became pluralized we cannot outline, but may only fancy. The native abode of the Muses was in the extreme north of Hellas, hence their kinship with the Zeus of Olympus and their association with Orpheus. At Delphi they became attached to Apollo, and in the south, Mount Helicon in Boeotia was their permanent center. We know of many Greek states in which Moseia, or schools under the patronage of the Muses, were established for the advanced education of the youth. The Muses were recognized in groups of various numbers, but that in which 9 were enumerated became fixed as the standard, although the differentiation of their functions and personalities took place only late and not always along logical lines. The 9 were formally divided, as shown in the appended table, into the 3 classes corresponding to the great departments of literature. Class Epos. 1. Calliope, or sweet-voiced. Sphere, heroic epic. Attribute, writing tablet. 2. Cleo, or praise. Sphere, historical epic. Attribute, scroll or writing tablet. 3. Orania, or heavenly. Sphere, astronomical epic. Attribute, globe. Class lyric. Erato, or loveliness. Sphere, love lyric. Attribute, zither. Terpsicho, or delight in the dance. Sphere, choral lyric. Attribute, lyre. Euterpe, or delight. Sphere, flute music. Attribute, flute. Class, drama. 1. Melpomene, or song. Sphere, tragedy. Attribute, tragic mask. Thaleia, or luxuriant beauty. Sphere, comedy. Attribute, comic mask. Polymnia, or many hymns. Sphere, religious. Attribute, no definite attribute. Ganymedes. The story of Ganymedes, the beautiful son of Tros of Ilion, is found in its most attractive form in the persuasive words of Aphrodite addressed to Anchises in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. Indeed, counseling Zeus snatched away golden-haired Ganymedes for his beauty's sake, that he might dwell with the immortals and in the home of Zeus be a cupbearer to the gods, a marvel to look upon, held in high honour as he pours the ruddy nectar from a golden bowl. And inexorable grief possessed the soul of Tros, nor did he know whither the divine whirlwind had hurried his dear son. Then indeed did he mourn him unceasingly day after day, and Zeus had pity on him, and gave him as a recompense for his son swift steeds, such as draw the immortals. These he gave him as a gift, and Hermes, at the behest of Zeus, told him clearly that, like the gods, he should never die nor know old age. In the most widely known form of the story, Ganymedes was borne aloft by an eagle, or by Zeus in the guise of an eagle. He seems to stand for the healthy beauty and joy of youth, and is a male counterpart of Hebe in her later aspects. Hebe. In origin, Hebe, or youth, seems to have been more than the mere personification of the charms of youth or of the well-preserved beauty of her mother Hera, for she was, rather, a spring divinity of flowers akin to the Horai and Charites. Or perhaps she was the earth goddess herself, regarded as in the prime of maidenhood. The legend which makes her the child of Zeus is undoubtedly not so old as that in which she is born of a strange union between Hera and a leaf of lettuce, and the not improbable suggestion has been advanced that Hebe was in a very early period the equivalent of Dione, the spouse of Zeus at Dodona, and that, with the amalgamation of the two stocks, whose chief deities were Zeus and Hera, Hebe was thrust from her place, and a myth was created to give her legitimate standing as a daughter in the new family. Like the other children of Zeus and Hera, she never enjoyed any great distinction. Her role was always that of an attendant. In the Iliad, she is the maiden cupbearer to the Olympians, and on one occasion she helps Hera get her chariot and horses ready for a journey, while at another time she performs the rather menial task of preparing the bath for the dust-begrimed Ares on his return from a battle. Iris. Iris is no more than a personification of the rainbow. Like the rainbow, she comes and goes without warning, while her speed of movement and her pathway across the heavens fit her for the post of messenger of the gods. She is clothed in the bright colours becoming to youth, and on golden wings she flits from place to place, performing the errands of her greater companions, notably Zeus and Hera. In her representations in art, she is scarcely to be distinguished from other winged figures, except when she is shown as bearing a herald's wand. Of the greater luminaries. Helios, or sun. From a remote time, many phases of the sun's power had been observed by the Greeks with an attention which was akin to adoration. But only in a few places did this develop into genuine worship, for the sun was altogether too corporeal an object to appeal strongly to the religious fancy. Yet it must have aroused in the mind some feeling of divinity, inasmuch as it was the daily practice of the Greek to rise at dawn and greet the sun with a kiss of the hand. And very early this luminary became a frequent theme in myths, although little by little these legends lost their distinctive solar characteristics in the popular consciousness. In myth, Helios is the son of Hyperion and Euryphaessa, or Far Shining, both of them Titan children of Uranus and Gaia, and Hyperion, or High Going, being transparently another name for Helios himself. Helios took as his wife Perse, or Gleaming, the daughter of Okeanos, their children being Circe, the sorceress of the west, and Aeetes, the father of Medea, the sorceress of the east. Pindar relates the story of another marriage which is of prime importance in our study, having to do, as it does, with the chief center of the sun cult among the Greeks. When the jurisdiction of the various departments of the world was apportioned, it happened that Helios, being absent, was forgotten. But although, on discovery of the error, Zeus wished to make a new division, Helios dissuaded him from so doing, stating that he was willing to receive as his share an island which he beheld rising from the sea. This Zeus granted him, and wedding the nymph Rhodos, or Rhode, the daughter of Amphitrite, Helios gave her name to the island and named the 3 cities of Rhodes after 3 of their sons. Helios is also said to have had as wives Leucotho, Clytia, and Neaira, the last of whom, according to Homer, bore him 2 daughters, Lampetie, who tended her father's cattle, and Phaethusa, who shepherded his sheep. There were 7 herds of cattle and 7 of sheep, each comprising 50 animals. That is, there were 350 of each kind. And Aristotle is probably right in seeing in these a reference to the days and nights of a lunar year. The herds were generally located either in Sicily or Crete. The appearance of the sun in the heavens reminded the Greeks of a variety of objects: a ball of fire, a head with streaming golden hair, an eye, a bow bristling with arrows, or a spoked wheel. But the most commanding and persistent likeness which they saw was that of a chariot and horses. Poets gave the 4 steeds names suggestive of the sun's outstanding properties, and had them feed on the same ambrosial herb which made Glaucus immortal. Homer follows Helios' course across the heavens from his ascent out of the stream of Okeanos in the east to his descent in the western reaches of the same stream, describing each stage with a wealth of epithet. The puzzle of the sun's nightly return from the west to the east the Greeks lightly dismissed with legendary explanations. Some said that there was a land of light whose boundaries embraced both east and west, and whose inhabitants, a good and kindly folk, stabled Helios' steeds each evening and led them out each morning. Others declared that Helios, chariot and all, was conveyed eastward every night in a golden goblet, although one poet, more appropriately, understands that the conveyance was a bed instead of a drinking vessel. Helios had genuinely ethical functions, and as one who took in the whole world at a glance, he was invoked in oaths. After the murder of Clytemnestra, Orestes appealed to him as a witness of his mother's establishment of a precedent in crime, and together with Hecate, he was a witness of the seizure of Persephone. Not only did he make clear the path of goodness and purity to those who sought to walk in it, but he was pure himself, as he showed when he shrank from the slaughter of the house of Atreus. On Rhodian coins, Helios is shown as in the full bloom of youth, from whose head, covered with a thick growth of hair, radiate streams of light. Phaethon. In Phaethon, or the Gleaming One, we cannot fail to recognize once more the person of Helios, but he has no standard genealogy, being in one myth the youthful son of Eos and Cephalos, whom Aphrodite seized and set to guard her temple by night, while elsewhere he is the son of Helios, either by the sea nymph Clymene or by Rhode. The most famous legend which grew up about his name recounts that he coaxed his father until he obtained permission to drive the fiery chariot of the sun for a single day. But since he lacked his parents' skill in handling the reins, the swift horses soon got beyond his control. In their mad career, they descended too low, and the flame of the car caused such great heat and so terrible a draught upon earth that Libya became forever a desert. The people of Ethiopia took on a black hue, and the channels of mighty rivers were dried. But at length Zeus smote Phaethon with a thunderbolt, and he fell from his car into the river Eridanos. His 7 sisters, weeping over his body, were turned into poplars, or poppies, and their tears became beads of amber, or rubies, while the Eridanos was given a place among the constellations. One version states that, in order to put an end to the drought and the conflagrations raging upon earth, Zeus filled the channels of the rivers to overflowing, and the great flood of Deucalion came to pass. The story of Phaethon probably had its roots in an ancient festival in which the death of vegetation in the heat of midsummer was celebrated by mourning. Selene. Selene, or moon, was too transparently a definite material body to become invested with the many and varied traits which go to make up a great personality. She was, in consequence, generally conceived merely as a planet with feminine characteristics, for the softness of a light appealed to the Greeks, as it does to us, as very feminine in comparison with the more virile light of the sun. Homer never fully defied her, and even in the later period, when her divinity was somewhat enlarged, she yielded up all her moral attributes to Artemis and Hecate. The regularity of her phases was altogether too mechanical to give to the Greek religious imagination that freedom of action which could create an entire circle of gods out of phenomena only vaguely comprehended or out of pure illusion. The family relationships of Selene are confused. In one passage, she is the daughter of Zeus, but again, she is the sister, or daughter, or wife of Helios, and as his wife, she bore to him Pandia, a daughter of surpassing beauty among the immortal gods. From her association with Helios, she was conceived as riding across the heavens in a car drawn by horses or bulls. But very often, poetical allusions to her car are patently metaphors. The classic legend of Selene is that which tells of her love for Endymion, the son of Aethlios. One night she looked down from the clear heavens upon this youth as he was sleeping near his flocks on the slopes of Mount Latmos in Caria, and at the sight of his beauty, a tide of affection rose in her heart, which her will was unable to stem. Coming down from heaven, she stooped and kissed him, and then lingered near him till dawn as he slept on, repeating these visits night after night, until her absences excited suspicion among her divine companions. When at length the cause of them became known, Zeus gave Endymion the choice between death and an endless sleep, and, choosing the latter, he may still be found asleep on the mountainside, visited each night by his pale lover, who keeps a careful watch over his flocks. Of phases of light. Eos. Eos, or dawn, the Roman aurora, was very early considered the equal of the great luminaries, this being clear evidence of the importance of the return of the day to a primitive people, lacking the means of producing strong and steady artificial light. Eos not only brought the dawn, but she was the dawn. She slept in her home among the Ethiopians, and, wakening when her hour came, rose from the stream of Okeanos. Or, again, she was thought to keep watch at the frontiers of day and night, driving night to the underworld, and letting day go forth after the morning star had heralded the return of the light. According to Homer, the sun spent the hours of darkness near her, so that at his appointed time she could call forth his gleaming chariot. It was she who roused the breeze of morning and sprayed the grass with refreshing dew. Sometimes, like the sun, she was conceived as riding in a car drawn by 2 or by 4 horses, but often she was thought to move by running, or by flying with wings growing from her shoulders and feet. She is commonly represented in art as winged, and with her hair streaming behind her as she speeds forward. Eos was uniformly the daughter of Hyperion, and, therefore, the sister of Helios and Selene. She had a notorious penchant for beautiful young hunters, for example, Cephalos and Orion, and another of her lovers was Tithonus, a brother of Priam of Troy. Enamored of his beauty, she carried him off in her chariot to the land of the Ethiopians, and, inasmuch as he was a mere mortal, she besought Zeus to grant him endless life. Zeus granted her request, but she had forgotten to ask also for the boon of eternal youth, so that, after many years, Tithonus wasted away with the steady advance of old age, and became only a burden to himself and to Eos. To get him out of the way, she enclosed him in a room for which only the faint cry of his voice could emerge, and finally, to end his misery, she changed him into a cicada. Their children were Memnon, who fell at Troy, Emathion, and Hemera. It is customary to account for Tithonus as the regular return, the waxing, and the waning of the day, and to explain Memnon, the dusky Ethiopian, as the darkness between evening twilight and the dawn, while Emathion and Hemera are masculine and feminine conceptions of the day. Helen and the Discouri. Helen, in myth the wife of Menelaus and Paris, has been considered by a number of scholars as originally a divinity of light, being identified now with the moon, now with the red of dawn, and now with the phenomenon of a single orb of St. Elmo's fire. This last was held to be fraught with evil, while the appearance of the twin globes, represented by Helen's brothers, the Dioscoroi, was regarded as favorable. Some scholars believe that the Dioscoroi were at first daemons of the morning and evening twilight. Of single stars and constellations: Astraios, Phosphorus, Eosphorus. Astraios, or starry heaven, was accounted the son of the Titan Krios and Eurybaia, but any luster that attached to his name was a reflection of that of the children whom Eos bore him. Eosphorus, or Phosphorus, and the winds Argestes, Zephyrus, Boreas, and Notos. The allegorical character of this parentage is clear at a glance. Eosphorus, or dawn-bearer, and Phosphorus, or light-bearer, are 2 names for the morning star, the planet Venus, whose Latin name, Lucifer, is a translation of Phosphorus. In the myths, Eosphorus was united in marriage with Philonis, or Cleobia, by whom he became the father of Philemon, a son, a Stilbe, Flash, a daughter, whose name is a manner of recording the fact of the unusual brilliance of the morning star. He was conceived as the forerunner of the sun and the dawn, speeding forward on a white horse, or a chariot. Like Phaethon, he was taken away by the love-smitten Aphrodite to be night watcher in her temple, an aetiological explanation of the absence of a star from the heavens until just before daybreak, and he was considered to have the power of fructifying the crops. Art portrayed him in the company of other divinities of light as a youthful rider bearing a torch. Hesperos. Not until a comparatively late day was Hesperos, or Latin Vesper, the evening star, identified by the ancients with the morning star. In the field of myth, he was called the son, and again the brother, of Atlas, and he had a daughter Hesperis, who as the wife of Atlas bore the 7 Atlantides, or Hesperides. For an obvious reason, he was always associated with the west, but when he scaled the lofty peaks of Atlas to gaze at the stars, a storm wind suddenly snatched him away, and he was seen no more. Nevertheless, he was honored as divine, and the brightest stellar body in the western heaven was given his name, while the memory of his piety and loving nature lived after him among men, so that his orb was known as the star of love, that is, of Aphrodite, of Venus, its religious importance lying in the ease with which the dates of festivals could be determined from its periodic movements. Pleiades and Hyades. Owing to their conspicuous character, constellations received much more attention among the ancients than did single stars, and 2 groups, one of 7 stars and the other of 5, which appear in the constellation of Taurus, were known to the Greeks, in fact, are still known to us, by the name of Pleiades and Hyades respectively, these belonging among the earliest attested star names. In Homer, Hephaestus depicts the Pleiades on the shield of Achilles, and by them Odysseus holds his course for Scheria. They and the Hyades were said to have been originally the daughters of Atlas through a union with Pleione or Aethra. But when their brother Hyas was killed by some creature of the wild, all 12 died of grief, and Zeus accorded them places among the stars. One ancient author, however, mothered them on the queen of the Amazons. As for the Hyades, as a separate group, a well-known legend identifies them with the attendants of Dionysius who were pursued by Lycurgos, but who, after they had safely delivered their ward to Ino, fled to their grandmother Tethys, and were appointed a constellation by Zeus. The names of the individual Pleiades and Hyades varied to such an extent that no purpose would be served by their recital here. Very early the Greeks fancied that they saw in the Pleiades a swarm of wood doves, and indeed many scholars seriously entertain the belief that their name was derived from the word doves. The ancients themselves ranged widely in their attempts to find the source of the name for the Hyades. To some, the peculiar resemblance of the form of the stellar group to a capital T supplied at once the initial impulse and an initial letter for the formation of Thebes, although, because of the Hyades' relation to fertility, others discovered a connection between their name and that fertile animal, the pig. The most popular derivation, however, was apparently that which linked the appellation with the verb to rain, for the seasons of their early rising and their early settings were notoriously rainy. A certain type of vase picture shows the influence of this traditional association, since it depicts Alcmene as being saved from a burning pyre by the arrival of 2 Hyades, who extinguish the flames with water. The rising and the setting of both Hyades and Pleiades divided the year into 2 parts, the portion between May and November marking the period of safe navigation. Orion. In treating of Orion, one must bear in mind that the name stands both for a constellation and for a mythical personage, and although the frequent confusion of the 2 make it impossible to say with certainty which was the original, it can scarcely be doubted that some of the sagas of Orion developed without reference to the stellar group. Homer, for instance, knows the two forms as distinct, although he does not always treat them as such. Were we to rely solely upon him, we should incline to the conclusion that the Orion of myth came first in point of time and was afterwards imported into the realm of the stars. But, on the other hand, late Greek and Roman writers allude only to the constellation. This stellar group is situated near Taurus, and, therefore, near the Pleiades and Hyades, and owing to its peculiar shape, it was also called the cock's foot, or the double axe. The period of the early rising of Orion and Sirius, the dog star, that is June, marks the end of the rainy season and ushers in the heat of summer, while the Pleiades and Hyades at the time of their early setting in November disappear from the western sky ahead of Orion and Sirius, as if driven away by them. In these astronomical facts, one can read without further commentary the meaning of some of the myths which concern these constellations. In the Homeric epic Orion, the meaning of whose name is unknown, was a hunter of remarkable beauty and of a stature that exceeded even that of the giants Otos and Ephialtes. Eos cast looks of love upon him and carried him away to her dwelling, but her inordinate happiness over her good fortune aroused the anger of the gods, and Artemis, deceived by a trick of Apollo, with her noiseless shafts, gave Orion an early death in the island of Ortygia, or Delos. Together with Leto, she set him among the stars, while in Hades his shade, armed with a brazen club, continued to pursue and kill the wild beasts which he had hunted in life. In the legends of Boeotia, Orion was a hero born of the soil in Tanagra, or Thebes. Once, when Pleione and her large family of daughters were passing through Boeotia, he accosted them, and although they immediately turned and fled, for 5 continuous years he relentlessly pursued them, until, moved by the unhappy plight of the women, Zeus exalted them all to the heavens, where the pursuit still goes on. Side, the wife of Orion, dared to vie in beauty with Hera, and for her boldness was consigned to Hades. In other cycles of myth, Orion was the son of Poseidon and Uriel, the daughter of Minos, and his father endowed him with the gift of moving swiftly over the sea, either by striding across it or by walking through it with his head high and dry above the waves, or again, by using the islands as gigantic stepping stones. From Boeotia he made his way to Chios, where he married the daughter of King Oenopion. But, partaking too liberally of the vintage of his father-in-law, he became intoxicated and attempted a serious crime against hospitality, whereupon Oenopion put out his eyes and drove him out of his home. As Orion wandered about, he chanced to reach Lemnos, and there he found Hephaestus, one of whose servants guided him to the sunrise, where the light of the solar rays made his eyes whole again. He then gave himself over to searching for Oenopion, that he might punish him for his cruel deed, but failing to find him, he at last joined Artemis in the chase in Crete, and there was killed by the sting of a scorpion. Ursa Major, or Great Bear. Bootes. The peculiar arrangement of the stars in the constellation known as Ursa Major has always attracted the attention of the peoples of the northern hemisphere. Homer knew it both as the bear and as the chariot, and the suggestion of its appearance as a vehicle is perpetuated in a couple of its English names, Charles Wain or the Great Wain, whereas the utilitarian American eye sees it as the Great Dipper. The Greeks explained its designation as the bear by the story of the Arcadian Callisto, near whom in the heavens was placed her son Arcus in the form of the stellar group, sometimes known to the ancients as Arctophylax, or guardian of the bear, but generally as Bootes, or ox driver. Of midsummer heat. Aristaios, Sirius, or Greek Serios, and Actaeon. As the legends which follow more than hint, Aristaios was an agricultural god of the primitive inhabitants of Greece, and in spite of his frequent confusion with Apollo, he seems to have been originally not a sun god, but a personification of the period of cooling Etesian winds, which give relief to man and beast and crop during the burning dog days. Apollo is said to have espied the beautiful nymph Kyrene hunting amid the foothills of Mount Pelion, and overcome by his passion, he bore her away in his golden car to Libya, where he wedded her. In process of time, she became the mother of Aristaios, and Hermes took the child to be his great-grandmother Gaia, who in her turn entrusted him to the Hours. These maidens nurtured him on nectar and ambrosia, thereby making him an immortal, and later he was trained by Charon in the arts of manhood, while the Muses instructed him in healing and prophecy, and from certain nymphs he learned the culture of the olive, daring, and beekeeping, fable declaring that he visited almost every land in the Mediterranean basin in his successful efforts to establish these rural industries among men. On one occasion he went to the island of Chios, where the heat of Sirius was causing a plague to spread among the Asian islands, and raising an altar to Zeus Ikmaios, a divinity of moisture, he put an end to the plague by the regular offering of sacrifices to him and to Sirius. Zeus sent the Etesian winds to blow for 40 days and cool the atmosphere, thereby acquiring for himself the title Aristaios, or best, and by following the example of Aristaios in offering sacrifices, the people of the island were thenceforth able each year to mitigate the extreme heat of midsummer. Aristaios married Autonoi, a daughter of Cadmos, and by her father became the father of Actaeon, of whose unhappy fate we have read in the stories of Thebes. Actaeon personified the strong plant growth of spring, withered by the parching heat of the summer weeks, and the madness of his dogs is a graphic representation of the supposed result of the heat upon these animals, an effect which is still popularly recorded in the expression dog days. Linos. The story of Linos affords an excellent illustration of the manner in which a myth and a personality could be evolved from religious rites. The name seems to have been derived from the sad refrain, "Woe to us," occurring in Semitic ritual songs, in which the parching of vegetation under the summer sun was lamented, while the ceremonies rested on the widespread belief that demons of heat and drought run about like ravening dogs. The parentage of Linos varied according to the localization of his story. In Argos, he was the son of Apollo and the princess Samathe, and, exposed by his mother for fear of her father, he was found by the king's hounds and torn to pieces. In anger at his child's death, Apollo dispatched a monster called Poin, or punishment, to tear children from the wombs of the Argive women. But when the people rose up and slew the creature, they only brought on themselves a plague from which they suffered until they gave Apollo a temple in their city. Another version, however, relates that the plague was sent because the king killed Samathe, and that it was ended only when the women of Argos appeased the souls of Linos and his mother with ceremonial prayers and dirges. Elsewhere in Hellas, Linos was the son of Apollo and the muse Calliope, or again, of Amphiaraos and Orania. As the son of the latter pair, he was killed by Apollo because in a song he rashly likened his gifts to those of the god, and was buried on the slopes of Mount Helicon nearest to Thebes. From the song developed the singer and lyre player, and in this capacity Linos became the music teacher of Heracles, although, as we have recorded among the deeds of that mighty hero, he met a violent death at the hands of his choleric pupil. To the musical gifts of Linos, myth gratuitously added others of an allied nature, crediting him with having been the first to use in the writing of Greek the letters brought from Phoenicia by Cadmos, and also declaring that he was a grammarian and, like Orpheus, the author of philosophical works. Laerces. The personality of Laerces, a prayer for dew, who was, according to the legends, a son of Midas, also grew in part out of a midsummer song. Under the pretense of hospitality, he made a practice of luring passers-by into his palace, but once they were in his power, he would take them to the harvest fields, wrap them in sheaves, and cut off their heads, until at length Heracles came on the scene, and, killing him, threw his body into the Meander River. Another form of the story represents Laerces as engaging in mowing contests in the fields. On achieving victory in each contest, he would cruelly scourge his defeated competitor, but in the end he was himself defeated by a stronger mower. In these stories, a combination of several features may be observed. The scourging is an allusion to the primitive practice of whipping up laggard mowers, and the treatment accorded to the last mower reflects an ancient custom which was designed to ensure successful reaping on the following day, while the disposal of the prince's body in the river seems to be a fanciful portrayal of a magic rite to produce dew. Chapter 12. The Lesser Gods, of Water, Wind, and Wild. And hark, below, the many-voiced earth, the chanting of the old religious trees, rustle of far-off waters, woven sounds of small and multitudinous lives awake, peopling the grasses and the pools with joy, uttering their meaning to the mystic night. These words of Pirha in Moody's Firebringer interpret for us the peculiar appeal of terrestrial nature to the Greek far better than a multitude of well-turned periods of the most logical prose. And, moreover, through suggestion, they subtly reveal that the sources of the appeal are as numerous as are the departments of nature. It is hopeless for us to think of obtaining for this presentation a just and adequate classification of these departments. If only we obtain a convenient one, we must be content. Of the water. Okeanos and the Okeanides. When Pausanias makes the statement that Okeanos is not a river, but the farthest sea that is navigated by men, he is assuming the role of the enlightened teacher and is consciously correcting an ignorant public. For from the age of Homer, and doubtless before, men had no other thought than that it was a deep, refluent stream of fresh water. Homer distinguishes clearly between it and the salt sea, the Mediterranean, and deems it the father of all being, human and divine, and the source of all mundane waters. Hesiod accounts Okeanos as the son of Oranos and Gaia, and the husband of his supernatural counterpart Tethys, by whom he begat the rivers, brooks, and springs of earth, 3,000 divine daughters, the Okeanides, and 3,000 divine sons. 9 parts of the water of Okeanos, says Hesiod, flow about earth and sea, while the 10th part becomes the Styx and flows underneath the earth, bursting out again through a rocky opening. As to the location of Okeanos, we are told that it is the outer boundary of the upper world, and also the border between the netherworld and the heavens. The Cimmerians dwelt on its northern shore, the Ethiopians on the eastern and the western, and the dwarf-like pygmies on the southern. But nowhere in Greek literature is it even hinted that people believed in the existence of a further and outer shore. In art, Okeanos is shown reclining like the river gods, but he can be distinguished from them by his possession of a steering oar or by the presence of sea animals near him. Rivers. The belief in the divinity of rivers was general among the Greeks, this doubtless arising from the speed and strength of their currents down the steep mountain valleys, as well as from their stimulating influence upon vegetation. They usually passed on as the sons of Okeanos, but sometimes as the sons of Zeus. Their relations to Poseidon are not clear. They were conceived as being now of human form, now of animal shape, now of a combination of the two. The Achelous, for example, appeared to men with the body of a bull and the head of a man, bearded and horned, while in human shape the Scamandros talked and fought with Achilles, and was in turn attacked by Hephaestus. In Homer, the river gods are found in the great council of Zeus. The chief function of the rivers was the bestowal of fertility, and so important was this to the growth and even to the existence of many communities that rivers were often worshipped as the founders both of the local stocks and of the local culture. The Asopos occupied this high place in Philoas and Sacyon, the Anachos in Argos, the Peneios in Thessaly, the Eurotas in Sparta, and the Kephisos in Boeotia, while the role of Achilles is obvious in his gift of the horn of plenty to Heracles, and such rivers as the Caicos of Mysia and the Himeros of Sicily were thought to possess powers of healing disease and of averting harm. The many early stories which tell of the union of human maidens with river gods apparently go back to rites, partly religious, partly magical, in which young women just prior to marriage were made fertile by bathing in the waters of a river. A pretty story is told of the river Alpheus of Elis. At first Alpheus was a huntsman who fell in love with Arethusa, a huntress maiden, but she refused his advances and crossed over the sea to the little island of Ortygia before the harbour of Syracuse, where she was transformed into a fountain of fresh water. In despair, Alpheus became a river. But since his love remained unchanged, he made his way beneath the sea until he came to Ortygia, and there mingled with the outflow of the spring. Springs, or nymphs. The first nymphs were the Naiads, who dwelt by deep wells and waterfloods, streams of ancient hills, and where all the wan green places bear blossoms cleaving to the sod. That is to say, they were spirits of the springs, and from them developed, by very natural processes, the marks and functions of the nymphs of hill and forest. In the life-giving element of the springs, the Greeks fancied that they saw a kind of female fruitfulness, whence the fundamental meaning of the name bride embodies the idea of pregnancy, although by long usage the word became less and less strict in its application, until at last it could be appropriately used to designate also the Nereids and the Okeanids, who essentially belonged to the larger waters. The Oreads, or mountain spirits, and even the Dryads and Hamadryads. In their proper sphere, which included all places, like caves and marshes, where moisture gathered, the nymphs were as potent as was Poseidon over the sea, or Demeter over the earth, and from their conception as feminine powers in the bloom of youth, they acquired all sorts of maidenly characteristics. They danced and sang, and ceaselessly made merry in their woodland retirement. They were the nurses of the infants Dionysius and Zeus. And again they were the chaste attendants of Artemis, while through their fresh charms they won many lovers from among both gods and men. In myth, the nymphs are, as a rule, simply the daughters of Zeus. The name of a mother is seldom mentioned, although the Melian nymphs come into being from the blood of Uranus, and in the Orphic hymns all nymphs are the offspring of Okeanos. Once in Homer, the nymphs appear upon Olympus, and they plant elms about the tomb of Andromachus' father. A group of naiads inhabits the island of Ithake. In various places, the divinities of many of the famous springs were reputed to have originally been women, most of whom had been drowned. The stories of the fountains of Perne and Glauce at Corinth and of Circe at Thebes being excellent illustrations of this manner of myth-making. There were also nymphs of cities, who were the daughters of the important rivers of the neighborhood, and who were in many instances wedded to the local eponymous hero. Some of these divinities were credited with the gift of foretelling the future, a belief which was derived not so much from the poetic fancy that running water talks, as from the conviction that the drinking of certain waters produced a state of inspiration. Indeed, the epithet of nymph-smitten was applied to persons brought up to prophetic ecstasy. The worship of the nymphs was generally limited to special sports in the open air, as in groves or the slopes of hills, or beside streams and natural fountains. Garlands of flowers were the common offerings of the worshippers, but very often cereals and animal victims were also given. The sea. Owing to their proximity to the sea, and to their manifold interest in it as a source of life and as a highway, the Greeks were from the remotest times much attracted by its numerous phases. Calm and storm and the various gradations between these conditions meant to them safety or danger. The countless forms of marine life opened a wide field for the free play of their fancy, while the uncertainty of the sea's depths and shallows and reefs kept them in a constant state of wonder. The only feature of the sea about which there was any assurance was its aqueous character, and this was so obvious, like Selene, the sea never became sufficiently divinized to be the proper material for myth. Those phases, on the other hand, which were marked by vagueness or vastness, or were susceptible of limitless variation, were eagerly seized by the myth-making mind. Pontos, for instance, was the sea in its aspect as a boundless barren tract, whereas Phorcys, the grey son of Platon and Gaia, together with his wife Ceto, represented in themselves, and in part in their offspring, Scylla, the Graiae, and the Gorgons, the monstrous elements of the sea, while the many arms of the Aegean, reaching far into the recesses of the mainland and islands, were personified by the 100-handed Briareus, or Aigaion. Atlas, who knoweth the depths of every sea, and himself stays the towering pillars which keep earth and sky apart, is really not a mountain, but rather the sea below, on which the heavens seem to rest. Triton. Triton is a figure of the roaring of the sea and the larger bodies of fresh water. He was known as the son of Poseidon and Amphitrite, and dwelt with them in a golden palace beneath the waves, although his special home seems to have been in Lake Copae or Boeotia. The Greeks pictured him as driving a horse-drawn chariot over the sea, and as holding a trident, or a dolphin, or a drinking horn in his hand. But his chief attribute was a sea shell, on which he used to blow loudly or softly, accordingly as he desired to arouse or to calm the sea. The artists delineated him as of human form above, but of animal shape below the waist, the line of union being concealed by a garment. In the later centuries, however, his lower parts were shown as those of a fish. A Boeotian tale narrates that the women of Tanagra, who had gone down to the sea to be purified in preparation for a festival of Dionysius, were attacked by Triton while they were in the water. But the god heard their cries for help and beat their assailant off. In another tale, Triton was charged with raids on the herds and shipping of Tanagra, until at last the people set out a bowl of wine as a trap, whereupon, drinking the wine, Triton fell asleep on the shore of the sea, and a man of the city chopped off his head with an axe. That is why the Tanagran image of Triton was headless. Nereus. Nereus, the ancient of the sea, portrayed in his person and family the multiform beauties of the sea. He was the issue of Pontus and Gaia, and by his wife Doris he begat a host of daughters, the Nereids, the beautiful nymphs of the inner sea, as opposed to the Oceanids, the nymphs of the outer sea. He was a benevolent old man, always ready to help those who were in trouble, his great age being marked by the hoary form of the breaking waves. Like certain other gods of the sea, he was an unerring prophet and gifted with marvelous powers of transformation. But in spite of his changes into many animal forms, he was forced by Heracles to point out the road leading to the golden apples of the Hesperides. In his true form, he was conceived as an old man with a thick beard and a heavy tangled mat of hair. His emblem was the trident. The Nereids seem to have stood for the ripples and waves of calm weather, those most famous in myth being Amphitrite and Thetis. Proteus. Proteus, the son and underling of Poseidon, was so far the master god of elusive sea change that the epithet Protean has become a synonym of the sophistical and distimulating mind. His two sons, Polygonos and Telegonos, met Heracles at Torone as the latter was returning from the country of the Amazons, and challenged him to a wrestling bout, but the hero threw and killed them both. According to Homer and Euripides, Proteus was the king of the Egyptian island of Pharos and the husband of a Nereid nymph. He was the herder and guardian of the seals and knew everything that took place in the depths of the sea, and also, like Nereus, all that had happened or was to come to pass upon earth. Through the connivance of his daughter Eidothea, he was seized by Menelaus and forced to reveal to him the state of affairs at Sparta and to direct him on his homeward voyage. Glaukos. The sea god Glaukos was said to have been at first an ordinary human being, the son of Anthedon and Alcyon, this being a mythological way of saying that he was a native of the Boeotian city of Anthedon. By trade he was a fisherman, and one day, when reclining on the shore after landing his catch, he observed that some of the fish, eating of a certain herb, came back to life and leaped into the sea. After tasting the herb himself, he too sprang into the water at a spot which the Anthedonians later called Glaukos' leap, and was transformed into a deity, being admitted into the circle of the sea gods after Okeanos and Tethys had purged him of all human imperfections, and becoming so skilled in prophecy that in this art he gave instruction to Apollo and Nereus. The artists were wont to sketch him as a fisherman equipped with fish traps and a fish basket, and as wearing the skin of a fish on his head. This story is, without doubt, essentially related to the more widely known legend of the search of the fountain of youth. Ino, or Leucothea. We are already aware of the role played by Ino, the daughter of Cadmos, in those events of the early history of Thebes which culminated in the great tribal movement known in mythology as the Voice of the Argonauts. Her function as guardian of the sailor folk, which she exercised under the new name of Leucothea, is exemplified most clearly in the Homeric episode, where she comes to the aid of the shipwrecked Odysseus. Seeing the hero exhausted by his efforts to save himself, she rose from the sea and sat beside him on his raft, giving him a magic veil and bidding him bind it about his breast, cast himself into the raging water, and endeavoured to swim to the Phaeacian coast. Following her counsel, Odysseus was kept afloat by the veil for 2 days and 2 nights, and on the morning of the 3rd day he set foot upon land. Sirenes, or Sirens. By nature, the Sirens, or bewitching ones, were akin to the Keres and Erinyes, being winged daemons of death who haunted graves and the underworld. The belief in them was deeply rooted in the minds of the common people, and Homer must have been aware of their special attributes, although he seems to have chosen only such of them as would serve his literary purposes. He is the creator of their musical gifts and is responsible for their association with the sea. The descent of the Sirens was not definitely fixed. They were reputed to be the children of Phorcys, or again, they were born of the drops of blood that fell upon earth from the broken horn of Achilles, while another genealogy accounts them the children of the same Achilles and one of the Muses. In Homer, they are 2 in number, though the vast painters generally represent them as 3. But in the sphere of popular religion, their number is unlimited by reason of their very nature, and any names that attach to them are invariably suggestive of meretricious wiles and charms. Hesiod locates these beguiling divinities in the flowery island of Anthiomessa in the Western Sea. Circe thus describes the Sirens to Odysseus. To the Sirens first shall thou come, who bewitch all men, whosoever come to them. Whoso draws nigh them unwittingly and hears the sound of the Siren's voice, never doth he see wife or babe stand by him on his return, nor have the joy at his coming. But the Sirens enchant him with their clear song, setting in the meadow, and all about is a great heap of bones of men, corrupt in death, and round the bones the skin is wasting. To the description, Circe added directions for defeating their witchery, and by following these, Odysseus and his companions passed safely by. But do thou drive thy ship past, she said, and knead honey-sweet wax, and anoint therewith the ears of thy company, lest any of the rest hear the song. But if thou thyself art minded to hear, let them bind thee in the swift ship hand and foot, upright in the masthead, and from the mast let rope ends be tied that with delight thou mayst hear the voice of the Sirens. And if thou shalt beseech thy company and bid them to loose thee, then let them bind thee with yet more bounds. The Sirens are often represented in tombstone reliefs and in vase paintings as birds standing or flying, and with human heads, which are occasionally bearded. Scylla and Charybdis. Among the most formidable monsters known to Greek mythology were Scylla and Charybdis, the former of whom regularly passed as the daughter of Phocris and Cratylus, or mighty. Up to the age of womanhood, she was a divinity of such beauty as to awaken love for her in the breast of Poseidon. But when Amphitrite discovered her husband's waywardness, she jealously threw magic herbs into the spring in which Scylla was wont to bathe, after which her rival became the horrible ravening creature against whom Circe warned Odysseus. She dwelt in a dim cave in the face of a cliff hard by his course, and as the vessel passed by, she reached out her 6 long and snake-like necks, with each head snatching a sailor from his bench and crushing him in her pitiless jaws. Over against Scylla was Charybdis, a less repulsive but no less cruel monster, who too had been born a goddess, being the daughter of Poseidon and Gaia. Her chief characteristic was an insatiable voracity, and, because of repeated thefts of cattle from Heracles, Zeus, with the stroke of a thunderbolt, hurled her into the sea, where, in the very path of ships, she sucked down black water 3 times a day, and thrice daily spouted it forth. Beginning with the 5th century BC, Scylla and Charybdis were localized in the Straits of Messina. Of winds and storms. A little knowledge of the meteorological conditions of Greece and of the manner of life to which the ancient Greek was bound by the very nature of things makes it plain why Hesiod called the winds a great trouble to mortals. One who is well acquainted with modern Greece writes, "In the winter the winds blow from every point of the compass and cannot be relied upon from one day to the next," while in strong contrast is the regularity of direction of the summer winds. In all this variety of air currents, sometimes humouring, sometimes thwarting the plans of man, it was not at all strange to see the operations of beings of independent will, and of those motley traits which go to make up personality. It was inevitable that the mountain hurricanes, which without warning swooped down on the sailor or fisherman who thought himself safe as long as he hugged the shore, should seem to be daemons of destruction. And it was equally axiomatic that the useful trade winds should be credited with peaceful and benevolent dispositions. Owing to their importance, the winds were very early given a place in cult, or in those magic ceremonies which can be differentiated from cult only with difficulty, and, consequently, as there were rain charms, so there were wind charms, to avert or to arouse the winds as necessity required. With the continuous development of chthonic elements in Greek rituals, the tendency gained momentum to identify the violent winds with malignant daemons of the earth. Yet, on the other hand, many of them were thought to reside in birds of prey, such as the sea hawk, while in the kingfisher dwelt the spirit of midwinter calm, whence we will speak of halcyon days. Boreas, Euros, Notos, and Zephyros. The most important winds, Boreas, Euros, Notos, and Zephyros, were classified in myth as the sons of Astraios and Eos. The character which Boreas, the north wind, exhibits in Attic myth holds good everywhere else. He is lustful, cruel, and strong, and with a decided bent for thievery. He is cold, blustering, and uncouth Thracian. He leaps swiftly down from the peaks of the hills, uprooting the oaks and shattering the ships which lie in his path. According to his caprice, he brings clear sky or cloud. Homer tells us that Achilles besought Boreas and Zephyros to fan the flames of Patroclus' pyre, and the Athenians of the 5th century attributed to Boreas' connection with them by marriage the destruction of the fleet of Xerxes of Chalkis. They habitually thought of him as a shaggy-haired and heavy-browed man, equipped with wings on both shoulders and feet, while, at Thorioi, he was regarded as so nearly human that he was given the rank of citizen and was assigned a domicile. Homer relates, however, that in the form of a horse he begat by the mares of Erycthonius 12 foals that could race over the sea without sinking, and over the tilled lands without leaving a footmark or the trail of a wheel behind them. The remaining winds are devoid of the sharp individuality of Boreas. From the southland comes Notos in autumn and winter, his beard heavy with clouds, and his grey poll dripping grey drops of moisture, while from his wings a leaden mist falls over glen and hill, and men and beasts and herbage become sluggish and sickly. Over the sea he spreads a dense mist, so that sailors despair of making port, and, in Horatian phrase, he is the wind than whom there is no greater ruler of the Adriatic. Along with Eurus, he hindered Odysseus's departure from Thrinacia and drove him back upon Charybdis. In the southeast is the home of Eurus, at whose warm breath the snows melt and rains fall. Zephyrus is the gentle wind of the west which gives strength to plants, and in a very childish allegory, myth makes him the husband of Chloris, of verdant herbage, by whom he became the father of Carpo, of fruitfulness. Aiolos. In the Odyssey, Aiolos, the steward of the winds, inhabits the floating island of Aeolia in the western sea, along with his family of 6 convivial sons and 6 convivial daughters. The story of how he packed the winds in a bag and gave them to Odysseus we need not repeat here. The person of Aiolos seems to represent the mobility and variability of the winds, and his children, living as they did in Saus und Braus, their rapacity, while his method of controlling them is paralleled in a primitive Germanic custom of bagging the winds in order to quell them. Harpies. The hated and destructive squalls that burst suddenly from the mountain valleys on the coastal shipping were well described in the appearance and the actions of the harpies, or snatchers, whom popular epithet styled the dogs of Zeus, and with good reason, as their treatment of Phineus has already demonstrated. These loathsome creatures had the arms and breasts of a woman, but all their remaining parts were those of a bird. The talons of their hands and feet were long and sharp, and with their wings they flew about with the speed of the wind. Their names, Aiolopus, or Stormfoot, and Occipate, or Swift Flying, being accurate registers of their nature. To account for such marvelous beings, mythology derived them from some monstrous sire, like Themis, or Typhon, or Poseidon. And since like begets like, they in their turn became the mothers of the swift steeds of Achilles, Erechtheus, and of Dioscuroi. Their home was in the Strophades, a group of islands in the Aegean, or, according to Virgil, at the very gates of the underworld. Typhon and the Cyclops. Apparently, Typhon and all the forms of the Cyclops, the Homeric, the smiths of Zeus, the spirits of the volcano, and the mythical builders of city walls, were originally storm demons. Of the wild. Pan, Silenoi, and the Satyroi. Pan has about him the unmistakable marks of a native of the hills and the grazing lands of Arcadia, his name denoting the grazier. It was in the Arcadian mountain, Lycaon, where he was born a son of Hermes and Dryope, or of Zeus and Callisto, and only among the pastoral Arcadians was his cult of national importance. On his favour to flock and herd hung the existence and the prosperity of the inhabitants, and with the spread of the story that in the battle at Marathon he reinforced the Greek cause by driving the Persians into a mad rout, his cult extended into every part of Greece. Nevertheless, with the exception of his exaltation in certain philosophical circles to the position of the All-God, a conception born partly from the false derivation of his name from the adjective meaning all, he had no contact with the spiritual life of the people. He always remained, as he is portrayed in the Homeric hymn in his honor, the unconventional, if not wanton, divinity of the wilderness and countryside. As the goat-footed, two-horned lover of the dance, he haunts the snowy height, the mountain peaks, and parts amid the crags. Hither and thither he fares through the thick copses, now enticed by the gentle streams, and now, climbing an exceeding lofty height overlooking the herds, he makes his way among the rocks. Often he runs over the long white ridges of the mountains, and often again over the foothills, slaying wild beasts and glancing sharply about him. Then at evening, returning from the chase, he sings alone and plays a sweet song upon the pipes. Not even the bird which pours forth her sweet lays amid the leaves of flowery spring can excel him in song. With him then join in the melody the sweetly singing nymphs of the highlands thronging round the darkling fountain, and echo resounds about the summit of the mountain. At the outset, Pan was simply a generative daemon of the flocks and herds, but the concept of his being a sort of ideal shepherd and protector was a natural sequel of this function, and in time his powers were so enlarged that he was held to exert an influence on the growth of forage plants, although he never became a full-fledged deity of vegetation. In the foregoing spheres, his emblem was the phallus. So far as wind and weather affected the condition of the cattle, Pan was a weather god, and doubtless his fabled skill on the pipes is a reminiscence of the primitive magical practice of endeavoring to control the winds by whistling or by playing on wind instruments. As the chief divine inhabitant of the solitudes, Pan contrived the special perils that beset hunters, herdsmen, travellers, and others who invaded his domains. The mirage was a device created by him to mislead and perplex, and panic, named after himself, was his coup de maître for suddenly dispersing great hosts. The satyrs and the Selenoi can best be comprehended, perhaps, in the statement that they are a plurality of Pans, although in them this playful and lustful character stands out in exaggerated relief. They combine the elements of human, brute, and inanimate nature more successfully than any other creatures of myth. By virtue of their connection with fertility, they frequently appear in the cycle of Dionysius as well as in that of Pan. The representations of Pan and his lesser congeners in art are, in more than the ordinary sense, myths in pictorial or graphic form. Two periods of their development may be observed, the dividing line being drawn roughly at about 400 BC. In the first, the human element predominates, all of the divinities being regularly shown as possessing the heads and bodies of men and the members of animals, such as horns, tail, pointed ears, shaggy hair, and the legs of goats or of horses. Toward the end of this time, types appear which represent them as beautiful youths, bearing here and there upon their persons mere hints of their semi-bestial nature. In the second period, the animal element becomes more prominent, but more smoothly fused with the human, and the types of Pan, the satyrs, and the Selenoi now begin to diverge along their own separate lines. Pan is now practically always seen with goat's legs and has a leering, sensual countenance, while the flute of reed, the goatherd staff, and the goatskin are his common attributes. All these characteristics are gradually taken over by the satyrs. Maenads and Bacchanthes. The Maenads and Bacchanthes were the spirits of the wild conceived as feminine. Although they were much less gross than their male companions whom we have just described, in that they were devoid of the bodily attributes of the animal kinds, nevertheless, they counted the beasts of the wild among their chief associates, and, despite their human form, they were distinctly unhuman in spirit. They had their birth in the belief, common to many primitive peoples, that the storms of the latter part of the winter release the daemons which put life into herb and tree. In fact, they were these storms themselves, wanton, wild, and free. Their natures brought them into an intimate alliance with Dionysius, and the role which they played in his rites has made their names synonyms of unrestraint and revelry. Wrought to a state of ecstasy by the shrill music of the flute and the clash of cymbals, they would shout and sing as they ran wildly to and fro, waving burning brands and thrissoi, or ritual wands. As Agave tore her unbelieving son Pentheus asunder, so the Maenads were said to rend the young of wild animals and then to eat their flesh raw. Dryads and Hamadryads. The spirits which were thought to inhabit trees were known as dryads or hamadryads, and they became classed as nymphs, as we have previously pointed out, by a very easy extension of terms. Under the name of dryad, the Greeks seem to have comprehended a female spirit dwelling among the trees, whereas a hamadryad, on the other hand, was the spirit of an individual tree whose life began and ended with that of her host. Stories which bring out the individuality of hamadryads, for example that of Daphne and Apollo, are simply the devices of mythology to explain the marked peculiarities of single trees or of single species of trees. Centauroi, or centaurs. Of all the monsters put together by the Greek imagination, the centaurs constituted a class in themselves. Despite a strong streak of sensuality in their makeup, their normal behavior was moral, and they took a kindly thought of man's welfare. The attempted outrage of Nessos on Deianira, and that of the whole tribe of centaurs on the Lapith women, are more than offset by the hospitality of Pholos and by the wisdom of Cheiron, physician, prophet, lyrist, and the instructor of Achilles. Further, the centaurs were peculiar in that their nature, which united the body of a horse with the trunk and head of a man, involved an unthinkable duplication of vital organs and important members. So grotesque a combination seems almost un-Greek. These strange creatures were said to live in the caves and clefts of the mountains, myth associating them especially with the hills of Thessaly and the range of Erymanthos. Chapter 13. The Lesser Gods of the Earth. Gaia. If a poet of this utilitarian day and generation can sing with such happy fancy, the earth that is the sister of the sea, the earth that is the daughter of the stars, the mother of the myriad race of men, why should we wonder at the Greeks' imputation of personality to the various features of the material world? This modern conception of earth, that is Gaia or Gay, is almost textually, we may safely say, that of the most ancient Greeks of whom we have even the vaguest knowledge. At Dodona, Zeus, the sky god, was coupled with the earth goddess, a union long consummated even then. In Homer's time, she was held to be a sentient being, although perhaps not quite personal enough to be a goddess, but later, in Hesiod, we find her consciously exercising the functions of parenthood. As we have seen in the chapter on the beginning of things, she was the mother, first of Ouranos, and afterward by him, of the Titans, of the Cyclopes, and of the Giants, and, by the indirect process of descent, of gods and men. While in the local myths we learned that men like Pelasgos, Cecrops, and Alcmenes sprang straight from her bosom. When she had brought all these into the world, she nourished them, enriched them, and gave them the mysterious power to reproduce their kind, whence at Athens she was venerated under the title Nourisher of Youths. Under the name of Gaia, however, the development of the goddess stopped, for Gaia was too obvious a suggestion of the material earth to stir the constructive Greek fancy into action, although certain of her epithets descriptive of different concepts of the earth power survived and took on attractive forms. Thus, as Pandora, or All-Giver, she became the theme of a significant myth, and as Pandrosos, or All-Bedewing, she plays a role in early Athenian religious history, while, partly from the righteousness of her oracles, as delivered, for instance, from her pre-Apolline shrine at Delphi, she became Themis, or Justice, although it was under the name of Demeter that she attained her highest and loveliest attributes of divinity. Yet there is another side to the nature of Gaia, For after death men were laid away in her deep bosom, whence they had first come, so that she presided over the host of departed spirits. And it was only natural that under the name of Persephone she ultimately came to be known as the queen of the lower world. She was associated with the Ganymedes, a festival in which ancestors were honored, and with the latter part of the Anthesteria, while in public oaths that bound treaties and alliances she was invoked, along with Zeus and Helios, as an ever-present witness of the solemn obligation. Rhea Cybele, Great Mother. Beginning with the 5th century, the names Great Mother or Mother of the Gods, Rhea and Cybele, were employed indifferently to designate a single divine being, a great earth goddess, and it is altogether probable that historically also they represented only one being. At Athens her official title was the first of the foregoing names, or its alternative form, and there, as early as the 6th century, she was accorded a shrine, known as the Metroon, which served as the depository of the state archives, an honour which seems to have come to her through her likeness to Demeter, who had already been naturalized. The name Rhea belonged rather to the circle of myth, being seldom used as a formal religious designation, while the mention of Cybele always called to mind the peculiar manner of cult connected with the Asiatic form of the mother goddess of earth. Rhea was primarily the Cretan conception of the maternal principle resident in the earth, and, as with the other gods, her functions increased with her recognition, until many were included which in reality had only a remote relation to her actual nature. In some quarters her name is explained as being possibly a Cretan form of earth, while in others it is connected with to flow, a relation which seems to put emphasis on her function as a producer of rain. In the Orphic genealogy, Rhea is the daughter of Okeanos and Tethys, but in the Hesiodic, the offspring of Orionos and Gaia. Becoming the sister wife of Cronos, she bears Hera, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Demeter, and Hestia, and in this way she plays a very important part in the early scenes of the world's history as set forth in myth. The story of her giving birth to Zeus in Crete is a mirror of her functions and cult, Zeus representing the herbage of spring emerging from the fertile bosom of Mother Earth, and the nymphs attending him being the countless kindly spirits which cherish the tender plants of earth. The Choretes, who later become an organized priesthood, are none other than the early Cretans engaged in the performance of magical ceremonies designed to encourage the productivity of earth. While the stone which Rhea gives Cronos to swallow must surely be a rainstone to bring rain upon earth. Finally, the death of Zeus as reported in Crete is, in the language of myth, the annual decline of vegetation, the fall of leaf and flower upon the breast of earth. In the 5th century, the name and worship of Cybele were introduced into Greece and spread abroad, largely through the influence of freed Phrygian slaves. The personality of this goddess included, without doubt, traits of many other local earth goddesses whom she had assimilated from time to time, and, as one may clearly observe in the legend which we are about to relate, she and her youthful favourite Attis are parallel cult figures to Aphrodite and Adonis. An almond tree wedded to the Phrygian river Sangarios became the mother of a handsome lad named Attis, who spent his childhood in the wilds among the beasts and birds, and became a herdsman who grew to manhood. His beauty attracted the attention both of Cybele and of the princess of the realm, so that they became rivals for his love. But when his marriage with the princess was about to be celebrated in the presence of a large gathering, Cybele suddenly appeared and smote the guests with madness. Attis, fleeing to the highlands, killed himself, and though Cybele entreated Zeus to restore the boy to life, all that she could obtain was the consent that his body and hair were to remain as in life, and that he could move his little finger. The legend just narrated seems to be an attempt to follow back to its sources the ritual in which the early death and rebirth of the young god of wild vegetation were symbolized by a fir tree. But Cybele was also associated with the vegetation of the tilled lands, this being suggested first by the legends which make her the wife of Gordius, the first king of Phrygia, and by him the mother of Midas, whom she generously blesses with the wealth of the earth, and secondly, by the myths where the daughter whom she has borne to the river Sangarius is joined in wedlock to Dionysius. The dependence of Phrygia upon her bounty for its well-being made her the chief divinity both of the separate cities and of the entire country. Cybele was attended by the lion and other wild animals, and by bands of priests known as corybantes and dactyloi. The former might be characterized as male maenads, so wild and abandoned were their rites, and in fact, they surpassed the maenads in this respect, even going so far as to practice mutilation of their bodies. The aim of their ritual was twofold: to advance the growth of vegetation, and to free themselves from eternal death by mystic union with the immortal goddess. Owing to the highly emotional and unreflective character of this cult, it was never thoroughly acceptable to the Greek temperament. During the 5th and 4th centuries, art did not succeed in elaborating a strictly Greek type of Rhea Cybele, who was often portrayed in a manner which suggested the Artemis of the wild beasts, a matronly figure seated, crowned, and accompanied by lions. Her later type was an amplification of the earlier, although barbarian traits now predominated. Lesser divinities of the underworld. Erinyes, Latin Furiae. After the murder of Abel, we are told in Genesis, God said to Cain, "The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." And from the same idea of the appeal of murdered souls for vengeance, the Erinyes was born. The Hebrew and the Greek differed, however, in the extent to which they severally elaborated the idea, since the former put the avenging power into the hands of God, and the latter into the hands of the injured souls themselves. The souls of the murdered man, according to Greek belief, could rise from the ground and as a free agent hound the murderer night and day until he made proper expiation for his crime, this avenging soul being an Erinyes. In time, through the influence of a common tendency to pluralize daemonic conceptions, it was expanded into a number of beings of a like nature, and as these became established in popular thought, they acquired an ever-enlarging endowment of attributes, the most important being those which they acquired from the earth out of which they came. As earth was generally conceived as feminine, so were they, and at times men even entreated them, as they would earth, for the blessing of a good harvest. Strange to say, the Erinyes did not pursue every murderer. Their vindictive fury was reserved especially for him who had committed the sin of sins, the slaughter of a kinsman, and herein lies the significance of the pursuit of Orestes and Alcmaeon. Each had slain his mother. Once established as defenders of the family, to the Greek mind the mainstay of the social order, their powers to enforce justice were broadened, and they now became the champions of the right of the firstborn, and of strangers, and of beggars. In Homer we find them depriving Achilles' horses of the gift of speech in order to correct an offense against the just laws of nature. They are generally, but not always, represented as being 3 in number and named respectively Alecto, Megaia, and Tisiphon. In imagination men painted them as repulsive caricatures of women. For hair they had a tangle of serpents. Instead of running, they flew about like birds of prey, In their hands they brandished scourges with which they threatened the victim of their pursuit. And the Taurian herdsman reported to Iphigenia Orestes' description of the Erinyes who assailed him. A she-dragon of hell, and all her head agape with fanged asps, to bite me dead. She hath no face, but somewhere from her cloak bloweth a wind of fire and bloody smoke. The wind's heat fans it. In her arms, see, my mother, dead grey stone, to cast on me and crush. Eumenides, Semnaithei, Maniae. Small wonder that the Greeks shrank from pronouncing the name of such dire beings as the Erinyes. Since a name has a happy way of cloaking realities, they called them in Athens Semnaithei, or revered goddesses, and at Kolonos the Eumenides, or benevolent ones. But in time they forgot that these epithets were only substitutes and built up new divine characters to suit them, such being the pliability of the myth-making mind. The maniae, or madness, of Megalopolis seem to have been of identical nature. Miscellaneous. Besides the Erinyes, there was a host of inferior hellish creatures popularly located in the underworld. The Keres passed now as the souls of the dead, now as malevolent death-dealing demons of an independent origin and existence. The stringers of empires were horrid winged creatures in the form of night birds who brought evil dreams and sucked the life-blood of sleepers. An imposer was a destructive monster with one foot of brass and the other of an ass. Lamia, who still lives in modern Greek superstition, was said to have been a woman of Libya whose children, begotten by Zeus, were slain by Hera, and who in revenge gave herself over to the perpetual task of killing strange children. In the underworld there also lived Hypnos, or sleep, and Thanatos, or death, twin sons of Nyx, or night, and Erebos, or darkness. Hypnos spent his time now on earth, now in the island of dreams, and now beneath the earth, exercising his power over men and gods as he willed, while Thanatos would come forth from below and clip a lock from the head of the dying to hasten the last breath. Chapter 14. The Lesser Gods. Asclepios, Abstract Divinities. Asclepios. Although, as we shall presently see, Asclepios was not, strictly speaking, an abstract divinity, yet the more or less abstract character of his function of healing affords some warrant for our present classification of him. The origin and the name of Asclepios. If the myths concerning the parentage of Asclepios are at all significant, he was the heir and successor of Apollo in the art of healing. This mythical relationship doubtless became established in some cult shrine of Apollo, such as that in Epidaurus, or even that in Cretan Gortyna, where the two were affiliated and where, in the end, the younger divinity ousted the elder from the first place. Whatever may have been the initial nature of Asclepios, his mature form seems to reveal a combination of two natures, chthonic and solar, and of this there are traces in the myths that are to follow. Some scholars see in the first part of his name a root which embodies the idea of brightness, but unfortunately this is so uncertain that it is useless as a confirmation of the partly solar nature of the god. It is pretty generally agreed, on the other hand, that the second part of the name signifies mild or soothing, a very appropriate quality for a dispenser of healing. Myths of Asclepios. Asclepios sometimes passed as the son of Arsinoi, the daughter of Leucippus, but generally as the son of Coronis, or Seagull, the daughter of Thessalian Phlegyas. Pausanias tells the story of his birth and infancy with an attractive simplicity. When he, that is Phlegyas, came to Peloponnese, his daughter came with him, and she, all unknown to her father, was with child by Apollo. In the land of Epidaurus she was delivered of a male child, whom she exposed upon the mountain, which is named Tithyon, or nipple. But one of the goats that browsed on the mountain gave suck to the forsaken babe, and a dog, the guardian of the flock, watched over it. Now, when Aristanes, for that was the name of the goatherd, perceived that the tail of the goats was not full, and that the dog kept away from the flock, he went up and down, they say, looking everywhere. At last he found the babe, and was fain to take it up in his arms. But as he drew near, he saw a bright light shining from the child. So he turned away, for surely, thought he, the hand of God is in this, as indeed it was. And soon the fame of the child went abroad over every land and sea, how that he had all power to heal the sick, and that he raised the dead. Another account relates that while Asclepius was still in the womb of his mother, a raven came to Apollo with the tidings that Coronis was unfaithful to him, whereupon Apollo straightway cursed the raven, which, in consequence, was changed forever from white to black, and hastening to Coronis, he slew her and burned her body on a pyre. Snatching the child from the midst of the flames, he took him to Charon, who trained him in the chase and in the mysteries of healing, whereby Asclepius became so skillful as a physician that he not only kept many men from death, but even raised to life some who had died, for instance, Capaneus, Hippolytus, Tyndareus, Glaucus, the son of Minos, and others. Zeus, however, fearful lest men too might learn how to revive the dead, slew Asclepius with a thunderbolt, whereupon, in reprisal, Apollo killed the Cyclops, and for this act had to make expiation by serving Admetus as a slave. The legend also tries to explain the healing means employed by Asclepius, saying that, through Athene, he secured blood from the veins of Medusa. With that which came from her left side he destroyed men, while with that which was derived from the right he brought them back to life. The people of Epidaurus said that Asclepius was first known as Epios, but after he had healed King Ascles of a grievous malady, he assumed the longer and traditional name. In Epidaurus his wife was Epion, but elsewhere she was Lampte, a daughter of Helios. Machaon, the hero physician, was always held to be a son of Asclepius, and sometimes Epion and Hygeia, or Health, were said to be his daughters. The serpent is the constant symbol of Asclepius in both legend and worship, the burghers of a certain Epidaurus in Laconia claiming that their shrine of the god was built on a spot where a snake had disappeared beneath the earth. In his sacred precincts in the Argive Epidaurus, and in those of Athens and Kos, which were offshoots of the former, the serpent was the living emblem of his presence and was thought to communicate means of healing to sufferers from disease as they slept in the holy place, the rite technically known as incubation. Asclepius was invariably attended by groups of priests who devoted themselves to surgery and other curative means, and many extant inscriptions tell of their wonderful successes. In the island of Kos in particular, the priests of Asclepius laid the foundations of the modern scientific study and practice of medicine. Asclepius in art. Owing to the failure of poetry to attribute any definite traits of face and form to Asclepius, the artists were thrown back upon their own ingenuity. They chose to represent him after the ideal of Zeus, but of milder countenance and of less majestic manner. He is shown seated or standing like the corresponding types of Zeus, though holding the scepter not as a mark of might, but as a staff on which to lean. The best representations of him are seen in the votive offerings of his shrine, where incubation or sleep cure was practiced. Abstract divinities. The same habit of thought which could clothe the mysterious operations of nature with all the features of personality could consistently treat in like manner the inscrutable processes of the mind and the qualities of things, whence we actually find the Greeks making these abstract conceptions over into divine beings. That this was not merely a late but a very early practice is demonstrated in the evident antiquity of Mnemosyne, Eunomia, and certain others of their kind in Hesiod. This entire class of divinities was treated in myth, when they were given any place at all, in the same way as were the more highly personalized nature gods, although they were debarred from the frequent appearance in this field. For temperamentally, the Greeks shrank from the bold literalness of their names. And some of the divinities recorded below are by nature perilously near the concrete. The list is of necessity far from complete, and must be regarded as supplying little more than mere illustrations. It will be noticed that some of the names have been discussed in earlier chapters, but here we see them from another angle. Of time: Eos, Hemera, Nyx, Chronos. Hebe, Geras, Kairos, opportunity or psychological moment. Of states of body: Hygeia, Hypnos, Thanatos, Limos or famine, Limos or pestilence, Mania or madness. Of states of mind: Phobos, Eleos or pity, Eidos or modesty, Eros, Himeros or longing, Euphrosyne. Of the spiritual faculties: Metis, Mnemosyne, Pronoia or forethought. Of the virtues and vices: Arete, excellence or virtue, Sophrosyne, temperance, Dikaiosine, righteousness, Hybris, offensive presumption, Anadeia, shamelessness. Of sundry social institutions: Telete, rite of the mysteries, Letai, prayers, Arai, curses, Nomos, law, Dike, precedent, Demos, the people, Eirene, peace, Homonoia, unanimity. To the foregoing catalogue we may add the personifications of the various phases of war and strife, that is, example, Nike, of victory, and of the several types of poetry. The element of chance. Owing to the importance of the element of chance in legend and religious thought, it is well to treat this abstraction by itself. Taiche. Taiche, or chance, was frankly the deification of the element of risk, and its relation to the plans and efforts of men to earn their daily bread and to better their conditions of life held it continually before their attention, so that men had to admit its existence as a real force. In the early days, when the Greeks had the self-reliant spirit of pioneers and a strong faith in the ability of men to bring to pass things which were not positively forbidden, Taiche received only meager recognition. But in the later days of their religious degeneracy and enfeebled initiative, they gratuitously endowed her with a power in contrast with which their own dignity as free agents entirely disappeared. Still more uncertain than the future of individuals is that of associations of individuals, and thus, from the 6th century onward, Taiche was exalted with gradually increasing frequency to the position of the goddess of the luck of the state, this development being doubtless aided in the Roman period by the influence of Fortuna. Moira, Moirai, Ananke, Adrasteia. Moira, or Isa, or fate, and the Moirai, or fates, represented the order of chance, or, in other words, the determinative elements which seem to operate amid the vicissitudes of human life. Ethically, they imply a much healthier point of view than the implied in Taiche. In Homer, it will be remembered, Moira was an almost impersonal decree issuing from Zeus, that is, She was herself the will of Zeus, although the other gods limited her scope of action according to their respective degrees of greatness. Somewhat later than Homer, she was conceived as an independent power, to which gods as well as men must yield. And in this aspect, she is ananke, or necessity, or adrasteia, or inevitable. In legend, the Moirai, who were reckoned as 3 in number, were appropriately the daughters of Zeus and Themis, and bore the names Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Plato may be following an old tradition when he states that, into the ears of man, Clotho sings of the present, Lachesis of the past, and Atropos of the future, and a late belief ascribed to them severally, in the order of which they have just been named, control over the birth, the life, and the death of mortals. Nemesis. The name of Nemesis seems to have been very first employed as an epithet of Artemis, intended to convey the idea that this goddess, as one who presided over birth, was also a dispenser of human lots. By the times of Homer and Hesiod, however, it had lost its character as a purely descriptive term and had become the name of a vague personality, while later it came to stand for the divinity who brought upon men retribution for their deeds, and who was especially hostile to excessive human prosperity. Pride breaks itself, and too much gained is gone. We read in a fragment of the Kypria that Nemesis was a winged goddess who flew over land and sea, and assumed the forms of many animals in order to escape the embraces of Zeus. But in the form of a swan, he overtook her at Rhamnos, and by her became the mother of Helen.